The world remembers kings, conquerors, and empires, but heaven remembers men and women who walked by faith. After the apostles of the Lamb, God never stopped raising witnesses. They preached when it was illegal. They believed when it was dangerous. They endured when it cost them everything. This is heroes of faith, the true stories of believers whose lives proved that God is real. His power is timeless, and faith still changes the world. Kindly like, share, and subscribe, and let their faith strengthen you.
The cell door had not opened at this hour before. Not once. Not in 5 years. He lay still on the wooden bunk, listening to the boots in the corridor, counting them the way a man counts footsteps when footsteps have decided too much of his life already. Outside, Yakutia was doing what Yakutia always did in the last days of April, pretending it was almost spring while the frost still owned the ground. He had learned the sound of this camp the way another man might learn the sound of his own house. The particular groan of the gate. The particular cough of the guard who always stood nearest the wire. Nothing about tonight matched anything he knew. A key turned. A voice told him to get up. Told him to change out of his prison clothes and put on his own, the ones that had been taken from him half a decade earlier and folded away somewhere in a warehouse of confiscated lives. Guess why? No one answered him. No one ever answered him. He had stopped expecting answers a long time ago. Somewhere between the first trial and the second, somewhere between believing he might see his children grow up and simply hoping he would not die exactly the way his father had. They put him on a plane before the sun was fully up. He did not know where it was going. He assumed, because a man in his position always assumes the worst first, that this was simply another transfer, another camp, another number, another 5 years stacked on top of the 10 he had already been made to carry. When the plane landed, there was no camp waiting. There was a holding center for the homeless in Moscow, and he spent the night there among men with nowhere to go, himself included, though he did not yet understand why he had nowhere to go either. In the morning they gave him a new suit. A stranger's suit, dark blue, the kind of suit a man wears to a meeting that decides his fate rather than one he chooses for himself. And then, finally, someone spoke to him plainly. He was told that because of his activity against the interests of the Soviet state, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet had stripped him of his citizenship. He was no longer, in the eyes of the only government he had ever known, a Russian. He was being sent away. Forever. He tried to protest. He told them his activity had never been against his country, only for his God. It did not matter. It had never mattered, not from the very first year they came looking for him, not from the very first time a judge decided that copying down an ancient psalm from memory made a man an author of crimes against the state. They asked him to write down the names of his closest family so that they, too, might eventually be allowed to leave the only home they had ever known. He was driven to Lefortovo, the same prison that had swallowed him whole once before, years earlier, when he was a younger, less broken man. And from there, to the airport. He did not know, as he was led onto that tarmac, that within hours he would be standing in a hangar on the other side of the world, watching 2 convicted spies walk toward the plane he had just left, while he and 4 other men walked the opposite direction, into a country that did not yet know his name but was about to learn it very well. He did not know any of that yet. In that moment, all he knew was cold air, a stranger's suit, and a silence so total it felt like the whole of Russia was holding its breath. To understand how a Soviet electrical engineer ended up on that tarmac, traded like currency between 2 of the most powerful nations on Earth, all because he would not stop believing in a book he was not allowed to own, the story has to go back. Back past the trials. Back past the camps. Back to a country that no longer exists, in a decade when believing in God out loud could cost a man everything he had, including, eventually, his own life. Georgi Petrovich Vins was born on the 4th of August, 1928, in a border town called Blagoveshchensk, in the far eastern reaches of Russia, so close to the edge of the map that Manchuria was visible across the river. He was born into a mission, quite literally. His parents were not settled, not safe, not comfortable. They were living out a calling that had already cost his father everything once and would eventually cost him everything again. His father, Peter, was an American citizen. Peter had trained for the ministry in the United States, in Kentucky, and had spent years preaching to Russian immigrants in Pittsburgh, until something in him would not let him rest in comfort while his own people, back in the land of his birth, had never heard the gospel preached freely. He gave up an engagement to be married in America because his fiancée gave him an ultimatum, her or Russia, and he chose Russia. In 1926 he sailed for Siberia. A year later he married a young woman named Lydia. A year after that, in the middle of their mission work, Georgi was born. The Soviet Union that Georgi was born into was already tightening its grip on anyone who dared to worship a king higher than the state. The secret police, the NKVD before it wore the name KGB, came to his father with a choice that sounded almost merciful on the surface and was, underneath, a trap with only one honest answer. Renounce his preaching. Go home to America, where he would be safe. Or keep his calling and give up his citizenship and stay. Peter Vins gave up his American passport. He chose the harder country. He chose to stay with the people he had crossed an ocean to serve, even though staying meant he no longer had anywhere left to run to. Over the following years, the state came for him again and again. 3 years in a camp. Then 9 months without even the formality of a trial. Then, finally, in the mid-1930s, a 10-year sentence that swallowed him whole. He had been pastoring a church of 1,000 believers in Omsk, in Siberia, before that last arrest. A thriving, living congregation, built by a man who had crossed an ocean and given up his own citizenship simply to stand in front of it every Sunday, and the authorities closed it the moment he was gone, as though a church were simply a building that stopped mattering once its shepherd was removed. It was not simply a building. It was 1,000 souls who had come to know Christ because one man refused to be safe. That is the inheritance Georgi Vins was born into, whether he understood it yet or not. A father who believed a Siberian congregation was worth more than an American passport. Georgi was only a small boy when his father disappeared into that system for the final time. For decades, the family did not know what had actually happened to him. They were told, eventually, secondhand, that he had likely died somewhere in the vast machinery of the camps sometime in the early 1940s. That was the story Georgi carried with him into adulthood, into his own ministry, into his own arrests. A story built on rumor because the truth had been buried in a file he would not be allowed to read for almost 60 years. Without a husband, Lydia took her young son to Kiev, where he grew up and eventually trained, of all things, as an electrical engineer. He graduated from the Kiev Polytechnical Institute in 1952, the same year he married a young woman named Nadia Lazaryuk. On paper, Georgi Vins had built exactly the kind of quiet, respectable, state-approved life that a boy whose father had been swallowed by the Gulag was supposed to build. Steady work. A wife. Eventually, 5 children. Natasha, Peter, Lisa, Jane, and Alex. An engineer's salary. A future that asked nothing of him except silence. For a decade, that is more or less the life he lived. It helps, here, to understand exactly what kind of country he was living in. This was a nation that had spent decades trying to erase faith by force. Churches across the Soviet Union had been converted into so-called museums of atheism, their crosses replaced with propaganda displays mocking the very God they had once been built to worship. In 1931, the government had dynamited the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow, one of the largest Orthodox cathedrals in the world, simply to prove a point to anyone still watching. Protestant believers had been forced, decades earlier, into a single state-approved denomination, permitted to exist only under constant government supervision, only so long as they agreed to keep their faith small, quiet, and contained inside 4 walls on a Sunday morning. This was the world Georgi Vins had been born into, and for a decade, it was a world he had learned to survive inside of by staying quiet. But there is a moment in the story of almost every person God has ever used greatly where comfort stops being enough, where the safe path starts to feel like a betrayal of something deeper the soul already knows to be true. For Georgi Vins, that moment did not come as a lightning bolt. It came as a slow, mounting refusal to watch his church surrender. By the end of the 1950s, the Soviet government under Nikita Khrushchev had launched a new and vicious wave of pressure against every believing community inside its borders. The state-recognized Baptist body, the only version of the Baptist Church legally permitted to exist, was forced to accept a set of new internal rules designed to strangle the faith slowly rather than crush it all at once. Children could no longer attend services. No one under the age of 30 could be baptized. Sunday schools were forbidden. Prayer meetings outside of the official Sunday service were forbidden. Printing so much as a single page of Christian literature beyond the walls of a registered church was forbidden. And Georgi Vins's own pastor, the man he had sat under, the man whose church he belonged to in Kiev, stood up and told the congregation to accept it, to comply. Something in Georgi would not let that stand. He was not a trained theologian. He held no seminary degree. He was an engineer who read his Bible on the side, married with children, with every earthly reason to stay quiet and let someone else fight this battle. But he could not sit under a pastor who was willing to hand over the keys of the church to a government that had already taken his own father. He challenged him, openly. It split the congregation, and it split something inside Georgi himself, the last thread connecting the safe life he had built to the man he was about to become. He gathered a small group of believers who felt the same conviction, and together they walked away from the compromised church and started their own. They had no building. They had no legal right to exist. So they did the only thing they could. They met in a forest outside Kiev, under open sky, singing hymns among the trees where no government inspector could easily follow. He would later explain the conviction behind that decision in words that capture the entire theology of his resistance in a single breath. Every authority, he believed, was ultimately established by God, and believers were therefore obliged to submit themselves to that authority in all civil matters, to work, to pay their taxes, to show proper respect to the government under which they lived. But when the question turned to faith itself, he said, believers submitted themselves to God, and to God alone. He was not, by his own account, a political revolutionary. He had no interest in overthrowing anyone. He simply would not let Caesar sit in the chair that belonged only to Christ. In 1962, at 34 years old, Georgi Vins was ordained as a Baptist evangelist. 3 years later, in 1965, the movement he had helped ignite formally organized itself into an underground body called the Council of Churches of Evangelical Christians Baptists. A man named Gennady Kryukov became its chairman. Georgi Vins became its general secretary. They called themselves reformers. The world would eventually call them something closer to the truth, the church that refused to be owned by an empire that hated God. By this point, hundreds of believers connected to this movement were already sitting in Soviet prisons for the crime of teaching children about Jesus, or printing a hymn book, or simply gathering to pray without state permission. And in May of 1966, the underground church did something almost unthinkable in a country built on silence and fear. 500 believers, men and women from congregations scattered across the entire Soviet Union, traveled to Moscow and gathered on Old Square, directly outside the headquarters of the Communist Party's Central Committee. They came to demand, openly, in the very shadow of the government that had been crushing them for a generation, that the persecution stop. It is difficult, from the safety of hindsight, to understand how much courage that single act required. This was not a protest in a country with a free press and the rule of law. This was 500 Christians, standing exposed, in the heart of the machine that had already imprisoned their fathers, their pastors, their friends, trusting that God was worth the risk even if the worst happened. The worst very nearly did. Soldiers and secret police surrounded the demonstrators, hiding the scene from ordinary passers-by, and herded them onto buses for interrogation. 2 days later, Georgi Vins went, along with other leaders of the movement, back to that same Central Committee building, not to protest this time, but simply to ask what had happened to the believers who had been taken. He wanted to know if they were alive, if they were safe, if anyone would tell his church the truth. For that question, he was arrested on the spot, dragged into a car by state security officers after nearly 2 hours of waiting, and thrown into solitary confinement. By November of that year, he stood trial alongside Kryukov and was sentenced to 3 years of hard labor, charged, among other things, with the crime of teaching Sunday school to children. He spent his first year in Lefortovo prison in Moscow, and the remaining 2 in a labor camp in the Ural Mountains. His wife Nadezhda was left behind in Kiev alone, raising 4 young children on her own, not knowing on any given day whether her husband would come home changed or come home at all. During that first imprisonment, in the very first month after his arrest, the authorities offered him a way out. He could remain nominally active in the Council of Churches. He could live at home with his wife and children. All he had to do was agree to become a co-worker with the KGB, to report, quietly, on his own brothers and sisters in the faith. He refused. It was the first of several such offers he would receive over the following decade, and he refused every single one of them, understanding clearly what every offer like that actually cost, not freedom, but the very soul of the church he had given everything to protect. He was released in 1969. He went straight back to preaching. The state, for its part, went straight back to hunting him. In February of 1970, his own mother, Lydia, the same woman who had raised him alone after his father vanished, was arrested and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Her crime was leading an organization called the Council of Prisoners' Relatives, a network dedicated to one simple, dangerous task: making sure the names of imprisoned believers were not forgotten, that the world outside the Soviet Union knew who was suffering and why. A mother imprisoned for refusing to let the world forget her son's brothers and sisters in the faith. That same year, Georgi himself was arrested a second time, not even for preaching this time, but for what the Soviet system quaintly called parasitism, the crime of not holding state-approved employment, because the state simply refused to recognize that being a pastor was real work. He served a year of forced labor in a Kiev factory. It is worth pausing here to think about what all of this meant for the children in that home. His daughter Natasha was still small during these years, and she would later describe, in her own words, exactly what it cost a child to grow up inside a family the state had marked. In her 3rd grade classroom, her teacher singled her out in front of the entire class simply for believing in God, mocking her as primitive, as unscientific, as an embarrassment to a modern Soviet education. Overnight, in a class of 30 children, she became the only one from a Christian family, and she became, in her own words, an outcast among her classmates. She was 9 years old. Her father had already prepared her, as best a father can prepare a child for something like that, warning her plainly that the police might come to one of their meetings, might arrest him, might take him away simply because he preached from the Bible, and telling her that whatever happened, the most important thing for her to remember was that her parents loved Jesus and wanted to live according to his word. That is what faith cost this family before Georgi Vins had even reached the darkest years of his ministry. Not just prison. Not just labor camps. A little girl, sitting alone at a school desk, learning far too early what it means to be different for Christ's sake. By September of 1970, Georgi Vins understood something that many believers before him have had to learn the hard way, that there is a cost to leading a movement the state has decided to destroy, and that cost only grows heavier the longer a man stays visible. So he disappeared. Not from ministry. From safety. He left his settled life in Kiev behind and became a fugitive pastor, moving between hidden homes, coordinating an underground printing operation the church called Christianin, the Christian, a mobile press that produced Bibles and pamphlets by the thousands, kept alive by ordinary believers who would quietly stockpile paper, sometimes a ton or more at a time, hidden until the press needed it. He officiated secret pastors' gatherings under the eyes of authorities who were searching for him across the entire country. He helped establish a secret seminary to keep training pastors even as the government tried to make sure there would be no pastors left to train. For nearly 4 years he lived like this. A man the state wanted badly enough to hunt across an entire nation and could not find. Kryukov, the man who led the movement alongside him, was never caught during those years. He continued directing the underground church from hiding for decades, a shadow the KGB could never quite close its hand around. Georgi Vins was not so fortunate. They finally caught him on the 31st of March, 1974, in Novosibirsk, in the heart of Siberia. News of his arrest did not stay contained inside Soviet borders for long. The Russian physicist and human rights campaigner Andrei Sakharov, a man with no particular reason to champion a Baptist pastor's cause other than a shared conviction that no government had the right to silence a person's conscience, personally pushed the World Council of Churches to join the growing international protest over his imprisonment. It was an unlikely alliance, a secular Nobel laureate and an underground evangelical movement, standing together because both understood that the freedom to believe, or not believe, was worth defending regardless of which side of that line a person stood on. What followed was the trial that would make his name known across the free world. It took place in Kiev in January of 1975, nearly a year after his arrest. The exact date kept deliberately secret by the authorities, though believers found out anyway and gathered outside the courthouse regardless. Only those with special passes were allowed inside, and most of those passes went to people hostile to Vins and to the faith he represented. But a handful of family members managed to get in. Among them was his mother, Lydia, the same woman who had already served her own prison sentence for defending prisoners like her son, and she brought a small tape recorder with her, capturing what she could of the 5 days that followed, smuggling the account out afterwards so the world would know exactly what had happened inside that courtroom. When she first saw him brought in, she barely recognized him. His eyes were sunken. His face was pale and exhausted. He told her, when he had the chance, that in the 10 months since his arrest, he had only truly been on his feet for the final 2. He refused a state-appointed lawyer, telling the court plainly that an atheist could not properly defend a man on trial for his faith. His family had arranged for a Christian lawyer from Norway, a man named Alf Haram, to represent him instead, but the Soviet authorities simply refused to grant Haram an entry visa, closing off that door before it could ever open. He made 17 separate requests to the court during that trial. Among them, he asked the state to produce its own official records, how many believers had been arrested since 1929, how many had died, how many Bibles and hymn books had been confiscated, how many prayer houses demolished, how many children stripped from their parents simply for being raised in a Christian home. Every request was denied. Among the evidence used against him was something almost unbelievable in its pettiness, and yet devastatingly revealing of exactly what kind of system he was fighting. Police had found, among his possessions at the time of his arrest, a handwritten copy of the 23rd Psalm. The judge asked him directly whether he had written it. Vins answered honestly that he had only copied it, that the words had been written nearly 3,000 years earlier by King David. The judge did not accept the answer. He told Vins he knew no King David. As far as the Soviet court was concerned, the man standing in front of them was the author. Part of Georgi Vins' sentence, absurd as it sounds, rested on the state treating an ancient psalm as if it were his own seditious pamphlet. On the 27th of January, 1975, he was sentenced to 5 years in a labor camp, followed by 5 more years of internal exile in Siberia, and the confiscation of everything he owned. Outside the courthouse, nearly 500 believers had stood for days in freezing temperatures, kept back by police, refusing to leave. When Vins was finally let out, his mother later recounted, the crowd began, spontaneously, to sing hymns about faith surviving exile, about the frozen plains of Vorkuta receiving in iron shackles the witnesses of Christ. Traffic stopped. No one moved. Believers pulled off their hats the way mourners do at a funeral, and the authorities, unsettled by the sight of it, quietly changed their plan and led him out through the back of the building instead, away from the singing crowd that would not stop. That is the scene worth sitting with for a moment. A church that had been told, again and again, that it did not matter, that it could be arrested, silenced, buried in paperwork and prison files, stood in the freezing cold anyway, and sang their pastor into exile. From Kiev, Georgi Vins was sent into the deep interior of the Soviet prison system, eventually arriving at a strict regime labor camp near a place called Tabaga, roughly 15 miles outside the city of Yakutsk, one of the coldest inhabited regions on the entire planet. He moved between several camps and transit prisons across Yakutia during those years, enduring winters that most human beings could not survive outside a heated building, doing forced labor in conditions designed to break a man's body until it broke his spirit along with it. He was permitted to see his family once a year. In October of 1977, during one of those visits, his youngest son Alex, only 3 years old at the time, did not recognize him. The boy had not seen his father since he was barely 1. That is what 8 years scattered across 13 years of imprisonment costs a family. Not just the man in the camp. The children who grow up learning their father's face from photographs. The physical cost was real too, and it would follow him for the rest of his life. Years of camp labor in some of the harshest climates on Earth left a mark on his heart that no amount of freedom would ever fully undo, a condition that would eventually require open-heart surgery even after he reached the safety of America. And yet, in his own telling of those years, Vins never framed his suffering as simple loss. "I am convinced," he would later say, reflecting on his years in Soviet prisons, "that faith is strengthened by trial, and that God offers spiritual comfort in proportion to one's physical suffering." The imprisoned Christian derives his support from God and prayer, which are sources of never-ending strength. He did not say those words from a pulpit, safe and dry. He said them having lived every syllable of them in a place built specifically to make them feel like a lie. There was, too, a strange kind of mercy at work even inside the machinery meant to break him. Vins later said plainly that his own treatment inside the camps improved noticeably once United States congressmen began publicly calling for his release, a direct, visible thread connecting a prayer meeting or a letter-writing campaign in some ordinary church back home to the actual physical conditions of a man sitting in a Siberian cell thousands of miles away. It is easy, from the outside, to wonder whether writing a letter to a government official on behalf of a stranger really changes anything. Georgi Vins would have told you, from first-hand experience, that it does. And yet, and this is the part of the story that deserves to be told slowly, because it is where the miraculous quietly breaks into the middle of the ordinary, even in that frozen, God-forsaken corner of the Soviet prison system, the gospel kept finding a way through. Vins had managed, through repeated searches, through soldiers who once caught him carrying it on a prison train and demanded he tear it apart, to keep a small hidden copy of the Gospel of Mark. At one point he was placed in a cell with 20 convicted murderers, men serving 10 and 15-year sentences for violent crimes, hardened in ways most of us will never understand. When they learned he claimed to be imprisoned simply for being a Christian, they mocked him for it. They asked him, half daring him, whether he even had a Bible. He did. He pulled out that small, worn copy of the Gospel of Mark and began to read it aloud to them. Something happened in that cell that no Soviet judge, no KGB file, no camp commander had planned for or could control. Men who had never once held a gospel in their lives began asking to hold it themselves. Began asking to touch it. The same men who had mocked him began gathering around, listening, some of them for the first time in their entire lives hearing the words of Jesus Christ spoken over their own sin, their own violence, their own broken lives. A week later, Vins was suddenly transferred out of that cell. His fellow prisoners, murderers, men society had written off entirely, begged him to leave the gospel behind with them. He did not want to. It was the only scripture he had, carried through years of searches and threats. But they pleaded and he gave it up. He did not know, in that moment, that he was about to be flown out of the Soviet Union entirely, into a country where Bibles sat unguarded on hotel nightstands. Which brings the story back to where it began, to that cold morning in April of 1979, the unexplained wake-up call, the stranger's suit, the flight to Moscow, the stripping of his citizenship. From Lefortovo prison, he was driven to the airport alongside 4 other Soviet dissidents, men named Alexander Ginsburg, Eduard Kuznetsov, Mark Dimshitz, and Valentin Moros. Officials on the plane finally explained what was happening, that an agreement had been struck between the White House and the Soviet government. It was not until the plane touched down on American soil that Vins and the others learned the full shape of the deal. They were being exchanged, traded, for 2 convicted Soviet spies, men named Rudolf Cherniv and Valdek Enger. In an isolated hangar at Kennedy Airport, the 5 of them walked off one end of the aircraft as the 2 spies walked on at the other. It was the first exchange of its kind between the 2 superpowers of the Cold War. A Baptist pastor from a forest church outside Kiev traded like currency for a spy, because the Soviet Union had finally decided he was more dangerous free in America's hands than he was silenced in a Siberian cell. Before he ever boarded that plane, a Soviet political officer had told him, almost mockingly, what to expect from his new life. American society would show great interest in him at first, the officer said, but in the end everyone would forget him. He would be of no use to anyone. His fate, the officer told him, was a sad one. He would always be in exile. Vins's answer, quiet and unshaken, was simple: "The God in whom I believe will decide that." When reporters met him in New York, Vins told them simply, "I thank my Lord that I am free." And then he told them something smaller, something almost domestic in its tenderness after everything he had survived, that the first thing he had seen in his hotel room was a Bible in the drawer. For 5 years he had been deprived of that book. He said there was no book in the world he cherished more. Later, once he had managed to obtain a Russian-language Bible of his own, he would call himself the most fortunate of all men. A strange thing to hear from someone who had just spent the better part of a decade in prison camps, until you understood that for Georgi Vins, freedom without scripture would hardly have counted as freedom at all. The whirlwind that followed was almost dizzying by contrast to everything that had come before. Within days he was in New York City, greeted by Mayor Edward Koch, served lunch in the mayor's office while, in the streets below, thousands of unionized city workers marched in protest against City Hall. Vins watched the demonstration with something close to wonder. It was, he said, the first time in his entire life he had seen people protest against their own government and simply walk away afterward, unharmed. In the Soviet Union, that same courage had cost men years of their lives. In America, it was simply Tuesday. 3 days later, 3 days after waking up in a labor camp cell in Siberia, Georgi Vins sat in a Sunday school class at the First Baptist Church in Washington, D.C., taught personally by the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. The lesson that morning, chosen long before anyone knew Vins would be sitting in that room, was titled, "A Cry for Justice," drawn from the story of a stolen vineyard in the 21st chapter of the first book of Kings. President Carter himself would later write that the parallel between that lesson and the man sitting in front of him was almost too precise to be coincidence. 6 weeks later, his wife Nadia, their 5 children, and his mother Lydia were finally allowed to leave the Soviet Union and join him. A family scattered by prison sentences and secret police for over a decade was, at last, standing together on free ground. He settled in the town of Elkhart, Indiana, and began, slowly, to learn English in a country that did not yet fully understand what he had lived through. He could have simply rested. No one would have blamed him. He had already given the state everything it demanded: years of his body, years with his children, the ordinary comforts most people never have to sacrifice for their faith. But rest was never really the point for a man like Georgi Vins. The moment he was free, he turned his freedom into a weapon for the believers he had left behind. Missions and organizations across the West competed for his attention, each one wanting him to represent their particular cause. He deliberately kept his distance from all of them and built something of his own instead, an organization that would eventually become known as Russian Gospel Ministries International, headquartered right there in Elkhart. Its purpose was simple and singular: represent, defend, and aid the persecuted evangelical believers still trapped behind the Iron Curtain, and keep the world from ever forgetting them the way the Soviet state had wanted them forgotten. He was invited to the White House by both President Carter and, later, President Reagan. He toured churches across North America, South America, Europe, and Australia, holding up photographs of men and women still sitting in Soviet prisons for the crime of loving Jesus Christ, asking congregation after congregation to pray for them by name, to write letters for them, to refuse to let them become statistics. And in 1988, the prayer that had driven nearly a decade of his ministry was finally answered. The last imprisoned believer connected to the Council of Churches was released from Soviet custody. The movement he had helped build at the cost of his own body and his own family's peace had outlasted the empire that tried to crush it. 2 years later, in 1990, Mikhail Gorbachev formally revoked the decree that had stripped Georgi Vins of his citizenship. For the first time in over a decade, he was legally allowed to return to the country of his birth. Throughout the 1990s, he made repeated trips back to Russia and Ukraine, preaching in the very cities where he had once been hunted, watching congregations gather openly in places where believers had once had to meet in forests to avoid arrest. And in 1995, something quietly extraordinary happened, something that had waited almost 60 years to resolve. Vins was granted access, in Moscow, to his father's actual KGB case file. For his entire life, he had carried an unfinished story about Peter Vins, a father who had simply vanished into the machinery of Stalin's camps sometime around 1943, or so the family had always been told, secondhand, without proof. The file told him the truth. His father had not slowly wasted away in some anonymous camp years later. He had been executed. The record of exactly how and precisely when carries some uncertainty even now, but the essential, devastating fact was there in black and white after nearly 6 decades of not knowing. His father had died a martyr's death for preaching the gospel in Russia, and his son, unknowingly, had spent his entire adult life walking the same road, prepared, if it came to it, to end the same way. Georgi Vins read that file at the age of 66, 3 years before his own death. He had spent his whole ministry not knowing exactly how his father's story had ended, and only found out near the very end of his own. Through the final years of the 1990s, Russian gospel ministries grew from a rescue and advocacy operation into something broader, translating and publishing Christian literature, supporting roughly 50 national pastors financially, helping fund the construction and repair of church buildings, shipping food, clothing, and medical aid, and eventually opening a medical clinic in Kiev to serve the very communities that had once hidden him from the police. In the fall of 1997, everything changed again. Doctors discovered a malignant, inoperable brain tumor. Treatment was attempted. It did not work. In a message he sent to his supporters around that time, Vins wrote words that stand, even now, as close to a final testimony as exists in his own voice, that the Lord was powerful and could shrink the tumor if he chose to. But if not, if instead God called him home to heaven, he would not be sorry to go. His greatest desire, he said, was not his own healing, but that the work of Russian gospel ministries would continue, whether he himself remained on earth or not. The ministry, he insisted, did not belong to him. It belonged to God. And God's work, he said, must go on. He kept writing. He kept making plans for the ministry's future, even as his own future narrowed to weeks and then days. On Sunday morning, the 11th of January, 1998, Georgi Vins died peacefully in Elkhart, Indiana, with his elder son Peter, the same son who had once served his own prison sentence back in Soviet Ukraine, at his side. He was 69 years old. His funeral was held 6 days later at First Baptist Church in Elkhart. He was survived by his wife Nadia, 5 children, and 3 grandchildren. Consider, for a moment, the full shape of the life that ended that morning. A boy born in a border town so far east that Manchuria was visible from his childhood window. A son who grew up not knowing whether his father was alive or dead for almost his entire life. A man who traded a comfortable engineer's career for a forest church with no roof and no legal right to exist. A pastor who watched his own mother imprisoned for defending prisoners like him. A prisoner himself, 3 separate times, roughly 8 years total scattered across 13, who was once accused in open court of writing the 23rd Psalm as though 3,000 years of scripture belonged to him alone. A man exchanged for a spy in a Cold War hangar who found a Bible waiting for him in a hotel drawer on the very first night of his freedom, and sat in a president's Sunday school class 3 days after waking up in a Siberian prison cell. A father who did not learn how his own father died until he was an old man himself, 3 years before his own death made the same kind of sacrifice complete, 3 generations deep. Russian gospel ministries continued after his death, exactly as he had asked. His daughter Natasha and her husband, a man who had once been a committed atheist himself before coming to faith, carried the family's calling forward into remote villages in Siberia, ministering in some of the very places where believers like her father had once been hunted. She would go on to write a memoir of her childhood, giving voice to what it had actually cost a family of children to grow up under that kind of pressure. A story that, in its own quiet way, extended her father's testimony into a new generation. She lived until 2019, carrying the family's mission forward for more than 20 years after her father's death. 3 generations. A grandfather, Jacob, who raised a son to love a country he had never even lived in. A father, Peter, who traded an American passport for a Siberian pulpit and paid for it with his life. A son, Georgi, who inherited a mystery about his own father's death and did not learn the truth until he was an old man, and who spent that entire uncertain lifetime prepared to walk the same road anyway. And a daughter, Natasha, who took the family's cost and turned it, one more time, into a calling for herself. Very few families in the history of the modern church have paid so consistently, across so many decades, for the simple right to tell people about Jesus Christ in Russia. There is a lesson buried inside every layer of this man's life, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Georgi Vins did not have to choose the hard road. He had a stable career, a young family, and a country that would have left him entirely alone if he had simply agreed to stay quiet. But he watched compromise creep into his own church, and something in him refused to accept a gospel that had been negotiated down to something the state found comfortable. He paid for that refusal with years of his own freedom, with his mother's freedom, with the childhood of his own children, who grew up watching their father disappear into a system that had already swallowed their grandfather whole. And yet, in the very worst of it, in a frozen labor camp near Yakutsk, in a cell full of murderers who had every reason to despise a man like him, it was not despair that had the final word. It was a gospel of Mark, worn thin from years of hidden survival, being passed hand to hand between men the world had thrown away, hungry for a single page of hope. That is what faithfulness under pressure can do. It does not always look like triumph in the moment. Sometimes it looks like an exhausted man in a courtroom, sentenced for copying down a psalm. Sometimes it looks like a mother recording a smuggled trial transcript with a hidden tape machine. Sometimes it looks like a church standing in freezing weather, singing hymns as their pastor is driven away, refusing to let silence be the last sound he hears from them. Every single one of those moments cost something real. None of it was easy, and none of it was fast. Georgi Vins spent nearly 50 years of his life inside a system built to convince him that God did not matter, that faith was a private eccentricity at best and a crime at worst, that the state's word was final and eternity was a fairy tale for the weak. He never believed it. Not once, not even when it would have been so much easier to. And that is the question this story leaves behind for anyone watching it now, in a season and a country almost unimaginably freer than the one Georgi Vins was born into. Faith rarely asks for a Siberian labor camp from most of us. But it does ask, in smaller and quieter ways, every single day, whether comfort will be allowed to win over conviction, whether a person will stay silent while something precious is compromised, the way Vins's own pastor once did, or whether they will walk into a forest with nothing but conviction and a handful of others who refuse to bow. The camps are gone. The KGB files are gone. But the choice Georgi Vins made over and over across a lifetime has never stopped being available to anyone who claims to follow the same God he did. If this story moved something in your heart today, do not let it end here. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel so more stories like Georgi Vins's can reach you. And if, somewhere in the middle of all of this, you realize that you have drifted far from God, that the fire that once burned in you has gone cold, or maybe never fully caught in the first place, please hear this clearly. You do not have to wait until tomorrow to come back. You do not need a perfect prayer, or a church building, or anyone's permission. Right where you are, right now, you can speak to God directly, honestly, in your own words, and He will hear you. Georgi Vins gave up an entire life of comfort because he believed God was real and worth everything. You do not have to give up nearly that much. You only have to come home. Do it now, before this video ends, before you close this tab and let the moment pass. And when you do, tell us in the comments where you are watching this from. We would love to know how far this story has traveled, and how many hearts, in how many countries, are turning back to God tonight.